any issue, that any departure from absolute regimentation may cause trouble. Any variation from the majority's opinion may inspire fear. Any spoken word in class, in the lunchroom, or on the campus that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. But our Constitution says we must take this risk. And our history says that it is this sort of hazardous freedom, this kind of openness, that is the basis of our national strength and of the independence and vigor of Americans who grow up and live in this relatively permissive, often disputatious society. Freedom to speak amongst our students has been a clearly established right for many, many, many decades. It affects a broad range of issues from students.
The Constitution is an important subject to students, not only as a subject to be studied, but also as a legal document that guarantees many of their fundamental rights. In a recent survey, over 50% of Americans could name at least 2 Simpsons characters. In the same survey, we were shocked to find that only 25% of students could name the freedom of religion. 11% of students knew the freedom of press. 1 in 10 could name the freedom of assembly, and 1% could name the freedom of petition. Just 1 in 1,000 people could name all 5 First Amendment freedoms. We took this to the test and interviewed our classmates. Can you name some Simpsons characters?
Simpson characters: Bart, Homer,
Lisa,
Marge,
Maggie,
Mo,
Ned,
Mr. Burns, Lenny, Carl.
Can you name the 5 freedoms protected by the First Amendment?
freedom, establishment of religion and practice, I think.
Freedom of speech.
freedom to peaceably assemble.
Freedom of press. Sorry, can I start over?
Making me nervous.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
Yes.
The right to bear arms.
Freedom of religion.
Right to bear arms. Referendable. Can't think of any more.
Freedom of peaceful gathering.
Freedom of assembly. Freedom of press. Freedom of religion. And I don't really remember any others. Freedom of petition.
After the American Revolution, the Continental Congress drafted the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, the Articles failed due to the weak central government and the high majorities needed in the Congress. Our founding fathers convened in Philadelphia to hold a convention to draft a constitution to create a new form of government. After several months of negotiations, the framers of the Constitution submitted it to be ratified by the states. One notable detail left out of the Constitution was a Bill of Rights. This was one of the reasons the Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution's ratification. This was a hotly debated issue, especially in the Massachusetts Ratification Convention. However, the Federalists managed to convince the Massachusetts Convention to ratify the Constitution with a promise to amend the Constitution with a Bill of Rights. This promise helped persuade opponents of the Constitution and achieve the 2/3 majority needed to ratify the Constitution. To their word, the first Congress passed an amendment for the Bill of Rights.
The First Amendment, I feel like definitely students overlook that. I don't think until they find out what happens here at school, especially in public school, how limited their First Amendment rights are when it comes to free speech, like with student newspapers or political speech, how limited it is. I think that is kind of eye-opening for students. And then they start to show some bit of relevance.
The First Amendment is still relevant to our lives and in our school today. The freedom of speech allows us to voice unpopular opinions at school, like the Tigard siblings and their use of armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. The freedom of press, a right defined in the 18th century, is still relevant today at our school. In addition to our school newspaper, there is an online version as well, a 21st century version of journalism. In addition, students are allowed to form clubs, exercising their right to assemble. There are many student-led clubs and activities at our school. School officials also work with students to accommodate religious groups, keeping the freedom of religion relevant at our school. A recent free speech case involving a student was Morse v. Frederick.
The Bong Hits for Jesus case I think it's significant for students because the Supreme Court came down on the side of the school district in that case in Alaska when the whole thing is this murky event, this school event to honor the Olympic torch when it was coming through the town, and it was an alleged school event, but it was after school and not on school property on a public sidewalk, and the student got in trouble for holding up a sign that stated "Bong hits for Jesus." And I think it's kind of crazy that the Supreme Court came down, in my opinion, on behalf of the school districts for that case, because I think it's limits students' free speech rights, and it makes a clear distinction between how much free speech you have at school versus, let's say, for example, political speech, like with the Tinker case, with the armbands, Tinker versus Des Moines, where had that student been protesting the Iraq War or doing something a little bit differently, maybe they wouldn't have gotten in trouble, but instead of just holding up a sign that said "Bong hits for Jesus," the Supreme Court ruled that was disruptive to the educational environment, even though it really wasn't in the school setting.
Bethel School District versus Fraser was another important case involving a student's freedom of speech.
And it's another example of how the schools can limit the speech of students. And that case involving election speeches that involved maybe some questionable language in the speeches, and a certain student got in trouble for it. Once again, the Supreme Court ruled that kind of stuff is disruptive to the educational environment. I think it says a message to students that you don't have a lot of leeway with school administrators, that if they think your speech is disruptive in any way, then they can stop your speech, which is, again, you have a distinction between political speech in school, which has been protected, versus non-political speech, like what this guy did in the Fraser case. And it's just important for students to understand that when they walk through the doors here at, say, Tigard High School, for example, your free speech rights are severely limited in some cases. I think it should be taught as soon as students are able to grasp these kind of concepts. I just think it should be taught throughout the curriculum, K through 12. So it's reinforced and students know what their rights are and what their rights are as citizens. I think it's incredibly important.